Welcome back to Bonnie's Life and to another episode of Global Intelligence Brief. Today, we are undertaking a critical, unvarnished analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war and the ongoing peace process. We are stepping away from the mainstream media narratives and Western talking points to look at the cold, hard facts on the ground. In this episode, we will examine the true state of the battlefield, the severe challenges facing Ukraine, Russia's undeniable military advantages, and the complex geopolitical realities that make a genuine peace agreement so difficult to achieve. This is an objective, data-driven assessment of a conflict that is reshaping the global order. Whether you are watching from Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas, the outcome of this war will fundamentally alter the economic and security architecture of the world you live in. We will look at the historical context that is often ignored, the economic realities that are driving the conflict, and the shifting alliances that are creating a new multipolar world. To understand the prospects for peace, we must first acknowledge the reality of the battlefield, a reality that is often obscured by optimistic reporting in the West. The truth is that Ukraine is not winning this war, and a total military victory over Russia is practically impossible. According to independent analysis from institutions like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia currently controls approximately 19 to 20% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. Despite massive Western military aid, including advanced tanks, long-range missiles, and fighter jets, Ukraine's highly anticipated counteroffensives have largely failed to dislodge Russian forces. In fact, throughout 2024 and 2025, Russian forces have continued to make steady, albeit grinding, territorial gains, capturing thousands of square kilometers and solidifying their defensive lines. The narrative of an imminent Ukrainian breakthrough has been replaced by the grim reality of a war of attrition, a type of warfare that inherently favors the larger, more industrialized power. The Russian military has adapted to the battlefield, learning from early mistakes and implementing new tactics that have proven highly effective against Ukrainian defenses. The human cost of this conflict is staggering, and it is a burden that Ukraine is struggling to bear. While both sides have suffered horrific losses, the attrition rate is disproportionately impacting Ukraine due to its significantly smaller population base. Estimates suggest that combined casualties could reach 2 million by the spring of 2026. Ukraine has likely suffered between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties, including over 100,000 fatalities. This has led to a severe and chronic manpower crisis for Kiev. The Ukrainian military is facing profound exhaustion, troop fatigue, and significant mobilization problems. Reports indicate that elite units, such as the 161st Mechanized Brigade, are being broken up and used to plug gaps in other depleted units along the front line. The country has entered what military analysts describe as an exhaustion phase. The harsh reality is that Ukraine is running out of men to fight, and forced conscription is causing deep societal fractures. Videos of recruitment officers forcibly detaining men on the streets have become increasingly common, highlighting the desperation of the Ukrainian military to replenish its ranks. Conversely, Russia has demonstrated a remarkable capacity to sustain its war effort, defying Western expectations that unprecedented economic sanctions would cripple its economy and military-industrial complex. Russia has successfully transitioned to a war economy. It has not only maintained but significantly ramped up its weapons manufacturing. For example, Russia launched over 50,000 Shahed-type drones in 2025, a five-fold increase from the previous year, demonstrating a massive expansion in production capacity. Furthermore, Moscow has deepened its strategic and economic ties with China, North Korea, and Iran, securing vital supply chains, dual-use technologies, and bypassing Western sanctions. Rising global oil prices exacerbated by conflicts in the Middle East have also provided Russia with the financial resources necessary to fund its military operations indefinitely. The Russian economy has proven far more resilient than Western policymakers anticipated, with the International Monetary Fund repeatedly upgrading its growth forecasts for Russia despite the sanctions regime. When we look at the diplomatic efforts to end the war, we must examine the root causes and the history of failed agreements. The mainstream narrative often ignores the role of NATO expansion in provoking this conflict. Prominent international relations scholars such as John Mearsheimer, have long argued that the relentless eastward expansion of NATO and the West's efforts to pull Ukraine into its orbit were viewed by Moscow as an existential security threat. From the Russian perspective, the invasion was a preemptive measure to prevent a hostile military alliance from establishing a foothold on its most vulnerable border. Understanding this perspective is crucial because any lasting peace settlement must address Russia's core security concerns. Ignoring these concerns guarantees that the conflict will continue or inevitably reignite. The failure of Western diplomacy to acknowledge Russia's red lines regarding NATO expansion was a critical factor in the lead-up to the war. The history of negotiations in this conflict is fraught with missed opportunities and broken trust. In the early days of the war, in March and April 2022, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators met in Istanbul and reportedly made significant progress toward a peace deal. This tentative agreement would have seen Ukraine commit to neutrality in exchange for security guarantees, potentially ending the war before the massive destruction and loss of life occurred. However, this deal was ultimately abandoned. Multiple reports and statements from officials involved suggest that Western powers, notably the United States and the United Kingdom under then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, pressured Kiev to walk away from the table and continue fighting, promising unwavering military support. This intervention effectively prolonged the war and led to hundreds of thousands of additional casualties, raising serious questions about the West's true objectives. The decision to scuttle the Istanbul talks may go down in history as one of the most catastrophic diplomatic blunders of the 21st century. Furthermore, the trust deficit between Russia and the West is absolute, stemming from the failure of the Minsk agreements. These agreements, signed in 2014 and 2015, were ostensibly designed to bring peace to the Donbas region and reintegrate it into Ukraine with special status. However, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and former French President François Hollande have since publicly admitted that the Minsk agreements were never meant to be a permanent solution. Instead, they were a diplomatic ruse designed to buy time for Ukraine to build up its armed forces and prepare for a future confrontation with Russia. For Moscow, this admission confirmed that the West negotiates in bad faith, making the Kremlin highly skeptical of any new ceasefire proposals that do not include ironclad, enforceable guarantees and fundamental changes to the European security architecture. The legacy of the Minsk agreements casts a long shadow over any future peace negotiations. Today, the peace process is effectively paralyzed because the strategic goals of the two sides remain mutually exclusive. Ukraine, backed by the West, continues to demand the complete withdrawal of Russian forces from all its territory, including Crimea, and insists on its right to join NATO. Russia, on the other hand, demands that Ukraine recognize the new territorial realities, meaning the annexation of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions, as well as Crimea. Furthermore, Moscow insists on Ukraine's permanent neutrality, the denazification of its government, and the demilitarization of its armed forces. For the Kremlin, this war is an existential struggle against the West, and it will not accept a settlement that it perceives as a strategic defeat. The Carnegie Endowment notes that for Russia, ending the war without its interests being taken into account would amount to condemning Russia to its doom. The maximalist demands of both sides leave little room for compromise. The role of the United States and Europe in this conflict is increasingly complex and driven by their own strategic and economic interests. The U.S. military-industrial complex has been a major beneficiary of the war. Foreign military sales by the U.S. hit a record $117.9 billion recently, a massive increase driven largely by the demand to arm Ukraine and replenish depleted European stockpiles. While the U.S. provides billions in aid, it is also securing lucrative long-term contracts for its defense contractors. The war has revitalized the American defense industry, boosting profits, exports, and political influence. This creates a powerful domestic constituency in the U.S. that benefits from the continuation of the conflict, complicating efforts to reach a diplomatic solution. The flow of weapons and money has created a self-sustaining cycle that makes peace increasingly difficult to achieve. Meanwhile, Europe is bearing the brunt of the economic fallout, facing high energy costs, deindustrialization, and the burden of supporting millions of Ukrainian refugees. The severing of cheap Russian energy supplies has fundamentally damaged the competitiveness of the European economy, particularly in Germany, which relied heavily on Russian gas to power its industrial base. Yet, European leaders continue to push for increased military spending and deeper integration of Ukraine into the European defense architecture, further entrenching the continent in a proxy war with Russia. The European Union has approved massive loans to Ukraine, but the bitter truth is that Europe is neither prepared to fight Russia directly nor engage in what the Kremlin considers a meaningful discussion about the future European security architecture. The disconnect between Europe's rhetoric and its actual capabilities is becoming increasingly apparent. As we look to the future, the most likely scenario is not a decisive military victory for either side, but a protracted grinding conflict that eventually settles into a frozen front line. Russia has the resources, the manpower, and the political will to continue fighting for years. Ukraine, despite its fierce resistance, lacks the manpower and the independent industrial capacity to expel Russian forces, and its reliance on Western aid makes it highly vulnerable to shifting political winds in Washington and European capitals. Any eventual ceasefire will likely reflect the balance of power on the battlefield, meaning Ukraine will be forced to make painful territorial concessions. The West will have to accept that its goal of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia has failed. The reality is that the war will end at the negotiating table, but the terms of that settlement will be dictated by the facts on the ground. The global order has already fractured, and the world is moving rapidly toward a multipolar system where Western hegemony is no longer absolute. The Russia-Ukraine war has accelerated the rise of alternative economic and political blocs, such as BRICS, as countries in the global south seek to insulate themselves from Western sanctions and financial dominance. The conflict has demonstrated the limits of Western power and the resilience of states willing to challenge the US-led international order. The peace process, whenever it finally begins in earnest, will not just be about drawing borders in Eastern Europe, it will be about negotiating the terms of this new multipolar reality. The era of unipolar American dominance is over, and the world is entering a new period of great power competition. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Global Intelligence Brief. Our goal is always to provide you with the unvarnished truth, free from propaganda and bias. If you appreciate this objective analysis, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think a negotiated settlement is possible in 2026, or are we looking at a permanent frozen conflict? Until next time, stay informed and stay vigilant.